Welcome to Restoria. I'm Arthur, and this is your quiet place for gentle bedtime stories. Get comfortable, take a breath, and let the story slow your thoughts and ease you softly into sleep.
The turning of the year. The last of the light was going off the high snow when the Kyluk came down the mountain for the evening. She came as she always came, without hurry, her feet finding the old track under the drift by memory more than by sight. The snow held her weight and gave it back. Below her, the glen had gone the colour of pewter, and the one small window of her hut showed a coal of firelight far down among the stones. She had walked the tops all day, as she had walked them all winter. Where she set her staff, the ground took the frost, and where she breathed, the pools closed over with a skin of ice. This was her season, and she had kept it faithfully, month upon month, since the first leaf curled in the back end of the year. Now the season was old. She could feel it the way you feel a fire that has burned down to its last good hour, warm yet and giving, but asking to be let go. The path bent at the great grey stone that had stood on the shoulder of the hill further back than she could reckon. And there she stopped. She always stopped here. From this turn she could see the whole of the glen laid out below, the frozen burn threading down the middle of it, the drifts banked blue in the hollows, the far wall of the mountains holding up a sky gone the deep green of old glass. A raven crossed it once, low and quiet, and was gone into the dusk without a sound. She stood a while and let the day settle in her legs. The cold did not trouble her. It never had. She was made of the same stuff as the mountain, the old stories said, and the stories were near enough right. Her face was seamed like a riverbed in a dry summer, and her hair went white as the tops, and her eyes held the pale blue that comes into ice when it is very thick and very deep. She had been young once, the tales allowed, though she herself no longer bothered to remember it. Below her a light wind moved the surface of the snow, lifting a fine mist of it off the drifts and carrying it down the slope in slow ribbons. The sound it made was the smallest sound there is, a dry hush, a whisper against nothing, the voice the snow keeps for itself when it thinks no one is listening. She had listened to it every night of her reign, and she listened to it now. Somewhere far below, under the ice, the burn ran on beneath. She could not hear it yet, but she knew it was there. The hut sat where the glen began to level, a low house of dry stone with turf laid over the roof, and a single door faced away from the weather. Smoke rose from the hole in the thatch and leaned off toward the east. She had built it herself in a year so far back that the trees standing round it then were all fallen now and gone to peat. She came down to it the last stretch of the path, and the drift by the door had grown again since the morning, and she pushed through it and lifted the latch. Inside, the fire had kept. It always kept. A low bank of peat glowed red under its own grey ash in the middle of the floor, and the heat of it met her at the threshold and drew her in. She set her staff against the wall by the door, in the worn place where it had leaned 10,000 evenings, and she pulled the door to behind her against the going of the light. The room closed round her, small and red and known. There was not much in it, and everything in it she had kept for an age. A bed of heather and old wool along the far wall, a three-legged stool worn to a shine, a shelf of stone with a few bowls on it, and among them one good bowl, blue glazed, that she had carried home across 3 valleys an age ago and had never once eaten from, because using it would have been a kind of ending she was not ready for. The plain bowls did the work. The blue one waited as it had always waited. She lowered herself onto the stool by the fire and put her hands out to the peat. The heat went into them slowly, finding the old joints, easing the knuckles that a whole winter of frost work had stiffened. She turned her palms and let the heat find the backs of them. Then she sat with them folded in her lap and let the day go out of her, the miles of it, the height and the wind and the far white distances, all of it settling down through her and into the earth floor and away. The peat smelled as it always had, of the bog it came from and of every fire it was kin to, a brown smell, sweet and deep and old. She had cut this year's peats herself in the full light of the summer before the cold came, and stacked them and let the wind dry them and carried them in creel by creel. Now they gave that summer back to her, one brick at a time, through the dark half of the year. There was a justice in it she had always liked. The warm seasons stored in the wall, spent slowly through the cold. Outside, the wind dropped as the last light failed, as it often did at the turn of the day. The hush of the blown snow faded with it. For a moment there was nothing at all to hear but the faint collapse of a peat settling in the fire and the beat of her own slow blood. She sat in it. She had spent more of her life in quiet like this than in any weather, and she had never yet found the bottom of it. After a while, she stirred herself to the evening's quiet work. There was a pot by the hearth and a little water in it from the morning's melt, and she swung it in over the peat on the iron arm that had hung there since the hut was young. Into the water went a handful of oats from the kist and a pinch of salt from the crock, and that was all. It was what she ate most nights. She had eaten grander things in her time, at tables that were dust now, and she found she wanted none of them back. Oats and salt and the fire under them, that was enough for a body made of hills. She let it come to the barest simmer and no more. While it heated, she took up the poker and tended the peats, not stirring them into flame, only easing them closer, settling the ash back over the red so the heat would hold long into the dark. This was a thing she did with great care and no thought, the way the hands know a task the mind has since handed over to them. One peat had burned hollow. She turned it with the poker and set a fresh brick beside it, and the fire took the new fuel without a flicker, only deepening, only glowing a shade redder in its bed. The porridge thickened. She lifted the pot off the heat and let it stand to cool a moment. And while it cooled, she named the months to herself, as she did every night at this hour. It was an old habit, and she did not know when it had begun. She counted them under her breath from the back end of the year forward, the dark ones first, and when she came to the last of the winter months, she said it in the old tongue, as her own foremothers had said it, a word with a burr in the middle of it that no living tongue used any more. She had never once said it the new way. The word was hers, and she kept it. When the porridge was cool enough, she ate it from one of the plain bowls, sitting on the stool with the bowl held in both hands for the heat of it. She ate without hurry. There was nowhere she had to be that she was not already. The peat ticked and shifted. Now and then a thread of blue flame stood up out of the red, wavered, and lay back down. She watched it come and go as another might watch a tide. When the bowl was empty, she wiped it clean and set it back on the shelf beside the blue one. And she rinsed her fingers in the last of the melt water and dried them on her skirt. Then she sat again. The night had come down full now beyond the walls. She could feel it out there, the great cold weight of it lying over the glen, over the frozen burn and the banked drifts and the sleeping deer in the birch scrub. All of it was hers to hold a little yet. She held it. Her staff leaned in its place by the door where she had set it. It was a plain thing to look at, a length of blackthorn worn pale at the grip and dark at the foot, and there was nothing about it to say what it was. But it was the oldest thing she owned, older than the hut, older than the peat, and with it she had shaped every winter there had ever been. Where its foot struck stone, frost ran out through the rock like a breath on cold glass. Where she laid it flat on water, the water forgot how to move. It had been a heavy thing to carry all these frozen months. Tonight, for the first time in an age, she was aware of the weight of it standing there, and glad it was set down. She rose and crossed to it and put her hand on the grip, not to lift it, only to touch it, the way you might lay a hand on the neck of a horse that had carried you far. The wood was cool and smooth under her palm. A whole year lived in it. The first hard frost of the back end, silvering the last of the brambles. The morning the loch went white from shore to shore in a single night. The blizzards she had walked in the thick of, wrapped in her own weather, driving the snow before her across the high passes, and the hushed hours after, when the cold sat down over everything and held it, and nothing moved from dark to dawn but the stars wheeling over the smoke hole. All of that was in the wood. She let her hand rest on it a moment more, and then she let it go. Back at the fire, she took up a fistful of fleece from the basket by the stool and began to tease it out between her fingers, not spinning it, only working it, loosening the matted wool into something soft enough to card. It was work that used the hands and left the mind free. The fleece smelled of the beast it came from, and of lanolin and of the buyer. She pulled it and turned it and pulled it again, and the pile of teased wool grew in her lap, pale and clean, and the pile of raw fleece in the basket shrank. Outside, the wind had come back a little, and she heard it feel along the turf of the roof and pass on. The habit of the hands went on without her. She had spun and carded and woven through more winters than there were stones in the wall of the hut, and the work had since stopped being a thing she did and become a thing she was, as the running is not something the burn does, but something it is. Her fingers found the knots and eased them. The fleece came clean. The fire held its red, and the evening deepened round her, one quiet task at a time, toward the middle hours. When the fleece was set by, she rose and lit the crusie on the wall, for the pleasure of it more than the need. It was a plain iron lamp, a shallow boat of metal on a hooked stem, and she fed it from the crock of fish oil she kept by the door, and set a fresh rush wick in the lip of it. She took a straw from the fire and touched it to the wick, and the flame stood up, no bigger than a thumbnail, a bead of yellow gleam that leaned and steadied. It threw a second glow into the room to meet the red of the peat, the two of them mingling on the stones, amber over the hearth and a paler gold along the wall. She tended the wick a moment, easing it up with the point of a pin until the flame burned clean and stopped it smoking. The oil had a smell of its own, fishy and honest, mixed now with the brown breath of the peat and the clean grease of the wool. These were the smells of every evening she had ever spent in this room, and she knew them as you know your own hands. She sat back down on the stool and let the two flames keep her company, the low red one in the floor and the yellow one on the wall, each doing its quiet work, neither asking anything of her at all. The house settled round her as the hour drew on. A dry stone house is never quite mute. It ticks and eases as the heat moves through it, a stone shifting a hair against its neighbour, the old timbers of the roof tree giving out a creak and going quiet again. She had lived among these sounds so many winters that she no longer heard them as sounds at all, only as the house breathing, as a body at rest makes its own faint noises without knowing. Up in the thatch a mouse went about its business, a small dry rustle among the turf, pausing, going on. She wished it no harm. It had wintered here as long as the hind had wintered in the birches, and it was welcome to its corner of the roof. Outside, the wind had settled to almost nothing. Now and then a breath of it came down off the tops and felt along the turf of the roof and moved on, and each time it passed she heard the faint hiss of dry snow lifting off the drifts and laying itself down again a yard further on. It was the same hush she had listened to on the path coming down, the voice the snow keeps for itself. Here, from inside the lit room, with the flames at her feet and on the wall, it was the pleasantest sound in the world. Whether on the far side of a good wall, the cold shut out, the heat shut in, and herself between the two, neither driven nor driving, only sitting. She had made the oil for the lamp herself in the back end of the autumn, as she made most things she used. It was a task she had never minded. the rendering and the straining and the pouring off, the crock filling on the shelf against the cold months coming. There was a kind of thrift in her that had nothing to do with want. She simply liked a thing she had seen the whole of, from its beginning to its use, the peat she had cut and the wool she had washed and the oil she had rendered, each of them carrying the print of her own hands. The short-lived bought their heat and their flame ready-made and never knew where any of it came from. She pitied them that, a little. To know where your fire comes from is to be at home in the world. The cruisy flame burned down after a while to a steadier, humbler gleam, and she did not feed it again. She had wanted it only for an hour, for the cheer of a second flame on the wall, and the hour was enough. She let it gutter gently toward its own end, the bead of yellow shrinking, leaning, recovering, until at last it drew down into the oil and went out with a thread of grey smoke that rose and lost itself in the roof. The red of the peat took the room back entirely then, and the walls went to that one colour, and she found she liked it better so. One fire was company enough. Her mind went out, as it will when the hands are busy, and it went to the deer. All winter she had kept them, the red herds of the high corries, as she had kept them every winter without number. They were her cattle, the old word had it, and she the herdswoman who moved them down from the killing heights before the worst of the weather and up again when the grass came back. She knew them as a body knows its own hands. She could not have said how many there were, and she would have known at once if one were missing. There was one hind she thought of now, an old one, grey about the muzzle, with a notch in her left ear from some hard year past. This hind had wintered in the birch scrub below the hut for as many seasons as the kayak could bring to mind, and each year she came down thinner, and each spring she went up fat again. And each year the herd was one calf larger for her. Twice the kayak had gone out in the black of a storm to find her mired in a drift, and twice she had leaned on the beast's warm flank and hauled and coaxed until the drift gave her up. They had an understanding, the two of them. Neither owed the other anything, and both turned up each winter all the same. Earlier that very day she had seen the hind on the edge of the birch wood, nosing down through the crust to the frozen moss beneath. The beast had lifted her head and looked at the Cailleach across the white ground, unafraid, chewing, her breath standing about her in a little cloud. They had regarded one another a moment. Then the hind had gone back to her feeding, and the Cailleach had gone on up the hill, and that was the whole of it. But it sat with her now by the fire, warm as the peat. The hind was fat enough. She would come through. Spring would find her waiting at the wood's edge with the rest, ready to go up. That was the whole meaning of the season, the Cailleach thought. If it had a meaning at all, not the cold for its own sake, not the ice or the drift or the driving snow. Those were only the walls of the thing. The meaning was the keeping. A hard season laid over the land so that the land could rest under it. The roots drawing down, the seed lying folded in the frozen ground gathering itself. The deer holding their lives close through the lean months so that the lives would be there to spend when the grass returned. Winter did not take. Winter kept. She had always known this, and she had never grown tired of knowing it. The fleece was nearly done. She worked the last of it clean and set the teased wool aside in its own basket for the carding another day. And she brushed the loose fibers from her lap into the fire, where they caught and vanished with a bright breath. Her hands were tired now in the good way, the kind that asks only to be set down. She folded them and looked into the peat. The red of it had banked down to an even glow, the heat coming off it steady and even, filling the room to its stone corners. She thought of all the turnings she had seen. Not the winters, the turnings between them and what came after, the handings over, the moment each year when the season went out of her hands and into younger ones. It had happened so many times that the times ran together like water. And yet each one, when it came new. Each year there was the same small ache of setting a thing down that she had carried so many years it had grown into the shape of her arms. And each year there was the same ease afterward, the lightness of the empty hands. She had learned to trust both halves of it. The ache was honest and the ease was honest. And one always followed the other, as the thaw follows the frost. For she was not only the winter. That was the part the short-lived tellers of the tales forgot, or never knew. They made two women of her, the old blue hag of the cold and the bright girl of the spring, and set them against each other, one driving the other out. But there had only ever been the one. She was the hag now, this last night, seamed and white and heavy with the year. Come the morning, she would go to the well at the head of the glen, the one that ran clear all winter under its lid of ice, and she would drink and the years would go off her like a coat let fall, and the one who rose from the well would not remember being tired. She would only be young, and the green would come up wherever she set her feet. But that was the morning. This was the night, and it was hers to keep, and she was in no haste to be young. There was a sweetness in this last of the dark that the young one would never taste, because the young one would never be tired enough to feel it. Only the old know how good it is to sit down. Only the heavy laden know the worth of setting down. She sat and she sat down, and the fire kept her, and she wanted nothing at all that she did not already hold. Her mind, loosed and drifting, went further back than the deer, further back than the hut. It went to the first winter she could bring to mind, which was not the first winter there had been, but the first she had kept with her own 2 hands. The world had been younger then, and rawer. The seasons had not yet learned their steady round. Cold came when it came, and stayed too long, or broke too soon, and the land suffered under it, never resting right, never gathering right. She had been given the staff and the well and the keeping of the cold half of the year, and told to make the cold sit down where it was needed and rise again when its work was done. It had taken her a great age to learn the doing of it. She had learned it the only way such things are learned, which is season upon season, mistake upon mistake, until the hands knew before the mind did. There were winters she had held too hard in the beginning, gripping the cold past its hour, and the spring had come up thin and late behind her. There were winters she had let go too soon, and the frost had crept back and caught the young green and blackened it. She had grieved those once, before she understood that even her mistakes were part of the teaching, and that the land was patient with her while she learned, because the land had all the time there was. By now the keeping ran through her without a single thought. She held the cold to its proper hour and set it down at the proper turn, as easily as breathing, and the springs came up even and green behind her, year on year on year. She thought of the making of the hills, which the old tellers laid at her door, and which she neither claimed nor denied. They said she had carried the mountains here in a great creel on her back, out of the north, in the beginning of things, and that where a stone fell through the worn wicker, a peak stood now. They said the lochs were her footprints, filled with rain. They said the boulders strewn across the high moors were the ones she had let drop when her arms grew tired. She did not remember it so, quite. But she remembered being tired in that ancient way the tiredness of shaping a world, and she remembered setting a great weight down at the end of a great labor and feeling the ground take it. And that was near enough to the tales that she let them stand. People need a story for where the hills came from. Hers was as good as any. She thought, too, of all the creatures asleep under her keeping out there in the cold. Not the deer alone, the whole hushed company of them, bedded down across the glen and the moor and the high ground, each in its own manner, each holding its life close against the frost. The hares crouched in their forms with their ears laid flat and the snow drifting a soft roof over them. The ptarmigan burrowed into the drifts themselves, gone white as the ground they hid in, breathing in the packed powder as easy as a swimmer in calm water. The trout hung motionless in the peat-brown pools under their lids of ice, their hearts gone patient, asking almost nothing of the cold season but to be let alone until it passed. She had a fondness for them all, the sleepers, the ones who met the hard months not by fighting them, but by folding down into them and waiting. There was a wisdom in it she approved of. The badger in its set with the year's fat on it. The frog gone down into the mud at the bottom of the lochen, its blood turned to something that would not freeze. The queen wasp asleep in a crack of the byre wall, carrying a whole summer's city folded up inside her, to be built again when the season turned. All of them trusting the cold to keep and not to kill, and the cold in her hands, keeping faith with that trust year upon year. That was the bargain of the winter. She had never once broken it. It pleased her to think of them settled and breathing while she sat by her fire. She was the keeper of their rest as much as of the ice and the drift. And this was the last of her evenings to keep it. In the morning, the thaw would reach them one by one, the hare and the bird and the fish and the frog, and they would wake in their own hours to a softening world and think nothing of the hands that had held it hard around them all the cold months. That was as it should be. A good keeper is not thanked and does not look to be. She had kept them. They had come through. The keeping was its own reward, and always had been. The mice in the thatch above her head, the beetles folded into the punk of a fallen birch, the very seeds lying out in the ground, all of them were her charges this one last evening. She told them over in her mind, one kind after another, and was content to have kept them safe. And the well she remembered clearly, every time. The well did not change. It had run at the head of the glen since before the glen was cut, clear and cold and steady, and every year at the turn she went to it old and came away young, and every year at the far turn she felt the age come back into her, a little at a time, from the back end of summer through the fall of the leaf, until by the first hard frost she was the hag again, white and seamed and strong for the cold work. It was not a thing that had ever frightened her. The young fear age, and the old, some of them, fear the losing of themselves. But she had been both so many times that she knew there was no losing in it. The girl remembered being the hag remembered being the girl. The one woman went round and round through both, and was never once broken by the turning. That knowledge lay in her now like a warm stone. Tomorrow she would be young, and the whole green business of the world would be hers to tend. The lambs and the leaf and the lengthening evenings. But she would carry this evening up out of the well with her, somewhere under the newness, the memory of the ember hour and the melting eve and the grey wall heavy on her shoulder. The young one always did. It was why, even in the brightest heat of the summer, there was in her a steadiness that the merely young could never have, a patience come down from all the winters she had kept and set down. The spring was strong because the winter had been long. The two halves made the one whole, and the whole was good, and she lay in the joint of it and was content. It was some hours later, in the deep middle of the dark, that the sound changed. She had been sitting near the edge of sleep, her chin dropped, the fire a warm red presence behind her closed lids, when a small new noise came into the room and drew her up. She listened. From the eave above the door, out in the black, came a sound she had not heard in half a year. A single drop of water gathering at the turf edge, letting go, falling to the stone below. Then, a while after, another. The snow on the roof had begun to melt. She sat still and heard it come. One drop, and the weight, and the next. The turf had held the day's heat from the fire beneath it, and now that heat was working up through the roof and easing the underside of the snow, and the melt was finding its way to the edge and falling. It was the first water to move in the open air of the glen since the back end of the year. Everywhere else the world lay locked, but here, at her own eve, over her own fire, the thaw had made its first mark. She had heard this sound at the end of every winter she had ever kept, and it moved her every time, the same way, with the same quiet gladness that had nothing of grief in it. She rose and went to the door and lifted the latch and looked out. The wind had gone entirely. The sky had cleared while she dozed, and a great moon stood over the shoulder of the mountain, near full, pouring its pale light down over the whole white glen. Every drift threw its own soft shadow. The frozen burn lay like a road of glass down the middle of the strath. Nothing moved out there but the melt at the eave, dropping, and the little wet stain it had begun to make on the snow below the door. The cold that met her face was not the iron cold of the deep winter. It had gone soft at the edges. There was a give in it. She stood in the doorway and breathed it. And under the old smell of snow there was something else, faint, green, rising off the ground somewhere far down the glen. Wet earth, the first of it. She knew that smell better than any smell there was. It meant the ground was opening. Somewhere under the snow, where the ground lay barest, a patch of moss had come clear, and the earth had begun to breathe again, and the breath of it carried up the glen to her door. In a day or 2 days, there would be a green blade standing in that patch where none had stood all winter. She would not be the one to see it as the hag, but she would see it. The one she was becoming would kneel down by that green blade in the morning and know it for her own. She stood in the doorway a long while, neither in nor out, the heat of the fire at her back and the softening cold on her face. The moon moved a hand's width down the sky. The melt dropped from the eve, a little faster now, the drops closer together, and the small water gathered below and ran a thread of itself out over the snow, and stopped and set hard again where the ground stayed cold. Even the thaw went gently here, a little forward, a little back, the year turning as a heavy door turns, not all at once, but sure. Down at the wood's edge, something moved. She found it with her eyes and held it. A shape among the birches, pale grey against the paler snow, stepping out onto the open ground with its head up. The old hind. The beast came a little way out from the trees and stood in the moonlight, and lowered her head and pawed once at the snow and raised it again. She was looking up the glen toward the hut. The two of them stood so, the old woman in her lit doorway and the old deer at the wood's edge, a field of moonlit snow between them, and neither moved toward the other because there was no need. It was enough that each was there. After a time the hind turned and stepped back in among the birches and was gone, and the Kailak was glad. because it meant the beast was easy, and an easy deer on a melting night is a deer that will see the spring. She drew back inside and let the latch fall. The room took her in again, red and low and warm. She built the fire up a little now, not much, setting 2 fresh peats at the middle of the glow and letting them catch, because this was the last fire she would tend as herself, and she wanted it good. The new peats smoked and then took, and a soft flame stood up among them and lit the walls with a moving amber light, and the shadows of the stones leaned and settled. She sat down again on the worn stool and gave her hands to the heat. Her thoughts widened out from the low red room. She let them go, the way you let a boat go from a jetty, out past the walls of the hut and over the whole of the sleeping land. Out there, under the same moon, the glen ran down to the sea a day's walk away, and every fold of it lay under her keeping yet. The frozen lochans on the moor, the birch woods with their branches furred in frost, the high corries where the last blue drifts would lie into the summer, the seed asleep in the black ground, the trees holding their sap down in the root, waiting for the word to send it up. All of it hers, this one last night, all of it resting the deep rest that only the hard season gives. She had heard the short-lived speak of winter as a cruelty, as a thing to be got through and forgiven. They lit their fires against it and counted the days until it broke. She did not blame them. Their lives were brief, and the cold was hard on brief lives. But she had known the season too well to think of it as an enemy of anything. The land needed its winter as a body needs its sleep. Without the cold to hold it still, the ground would wear itself out, pushing up green in every mild spell and losing it to the next frost, never resting, never gathering. The winter was the hush that let the year get its strength back. She was proud of it in her quiet way. It was good work. It had always been good work. And now it was nearly done. And the doing of it had earned this hour, this fire, this last sitting down in the old body before she gave it up to the well. She would not grudge the young one the spring. Let her have the green mornings and the lambs and the whole bright, noisy business of things growing. That was hers to love. But this, the still turn of the year at its darkest and most patient, the ember hour, the earned rest, this was the hag's, and the hag would not trade it for all the springs there ever were. each half of the year loved its own half best. That was how the whole thing held together. The fresh peats had burned down now to join the bank, and the flame had lain back into the red, and the room had gone from amber to an even glow. The melt still dropped from the eve outside, steady, unhurried, one and then the next. She had stopped counting the drops without meaning to. They went on at the edge of hearing, the pulse of the turning year, and her own breath had fallen into time with them without her choosing it. A drop and a breath, a drop and a breath. The old rhythm the world keeps when there is no one to hurry it. She looked once at the staff by the door. In the morning she would carry it up to the well and lay it in the heather by the water, and the young one would find it there when she needed it, come the back end of the year, when the wheel came round again and the keeping fell to the old hands once more. It was always the same staff. It was always the same well. It was always, underneath, the same woman, hag and girl and hag again, round and round, while there were yet seasons to keep. She looked at the blackthorn leaning there in the glow, its work done for the year, and she felt no sorrow at the sight of it, only the ease of a task carried the whole way to its end. By and by she left the stool and crossed to the bed along the far wall. It was a good bed, the best thing in the hut, built up over the years to just the height and give she liked. Heather cut in the summer made the underneath of it, springy and sweet smelling even now, and over the heather lay fleeces she had washed and dried herself, and over those a blanket of her own weaving, grey and brown in the plain check of the glen, heavy as a fall of snow. She sat on the edge of it and eased her feet out of her boots. The heat of the room had reached even here, into the far corner, and the wool held the heat where it had lain in it. She lay down on her side, facing the fire, and drew the heavy blanket up over her shoulder. The weight of it came down on her like a hand. This was the thing she had missed all winter, on the nights she had spent out in the weather, wrapped in her own hard cold. This weight, the good pull of the wool holding her down against the heather, telling every tired part of her that the walking was over and the keeping was done, and there was nothing now to do but lie here and be held. Her legs, that had carried her over the tops all the frozen months, let go their last stiffness into the give of the bed. Her back eased, her hands, curled loose against her breast, gave up their grip on the year just past. from here she could see the whole of the fire. It had settled to its night self, a deep bed of red under a soft grey skin of ash, with here and there a small vein of orange showing through where the heat still worked. No flame now, only the glow, steady as a pulse, throwing its heat across the floor and up the walls and into the corner where she lay. She watched it as she had watched it 10,000 evenings. It asked nothing of her. It only burned, low and faithful, giving back the summer one peat at a time, and she took the heat of it and was grateful, in the wordless way of a body letting go. The melt went on at the eve. She could hear it even from the bed, the small, patient drip out in the moonlight, loosening the winter roof by roof and stone by stone. It would go on all night, she knew. By the morning there would be bare turf showing at the ridge, and a wet, bare patch on the snow below the door, and the first true smell of spring standing in the doorway to meet her when she rose. The thought came and went without weight. There was no hurry in her toward the morning. There was no pull backward toward the winter. There was only this, the fire and the wool and the drip of the melt, the exact middle of the turning, the hinge of the year, and she lay in it at her ease. She thought of the well once, gently, as you think of a place you will go tomorrow and need not think of tonight. It lay at the head of the glen under its lid of ice, the water beneath running clear and cold and older than the mountain. In the morning she would kneel at its edge and break the ice with the foot of the staff and cup the water in her two hands and drink. And the drinking would take the years off her. Not all at once, but surely, the seams smoothing, the white going out of the hair, the weight lifting from the bones. She had done it more times than there were drops in the well. It held no fear for her, and tonight it held no hurry either. The well would keep. It always kept. For now she was old, and being old was its own deep comfort on an evening like this. The young do not know how to rest. They lie down and their minds run on ahead of them, out into the morning, into all the bright things they hoped to do. But she had done everything there was to do, many times over, and there was nothing out ahead of her that she needed to run toward. She had kept the winter, the land was resting, the deer were fed, the fire was banked, the staff was ready by the door. Everything that was hers to see to had been seen to, and the seeing to was over, and what was left was the sweetest thing there is, which is the rest that comes after good work fully done. The moon had moved off the mouth of the smoke hole now, and the square of light it had thrown on the floor had slid away to the wall and begun to climb it. The room dimmed as it went. The fire took over the lighting of the walls, and everything the moon had made silver went back to being amber and brown and red. Out beyond the stone, the glen lay under the sinking moon, and the melt dropped from the eave, and once, far off, a tawny owl called from the birch wood, a low, round note, and got no answer, and did not call again. The house held the heat in. The dark held the house. The mountain held the dark. She felt herself going down towards sleep, and she did not resist it, and she did not chase it. It came on as the tide comes, without any single moment you could name as the turn, only that the water is higher than it was. Her breath had lengthened. The weight of the blanket had become the weight of the whole warm room pressing gently down. The peats ticked as they cooled at their edges. The melt dropped. Somewhere under the ice at the head of the glen the well ran on, cold and clear and waiting, and somewhere under the snow a patch of moss lay open to the air, and somewhere in the birches an old grey hind stood sleeping on her feet, with her calf-to-be held safe inside her. All of it kept, all of it holding, all of it hers, a little while yet. The last of her thoughts were not pictures anymore. They had gone down under words, into the plain feeling of things. The heat of the fire on her face, the give of the heather under the fleece, the pull of the wool over her shoulder, the brown smell of the peat, the one small sound of the melt out in the dark, over and over, loosening the air. These were not things she thought about. They were only there, and she was there among them, and that was the whole of it. The fire sank another shade. The red banked lower under its grey. The heat held. The room was very still. Her hand lay open on the wall, the fingers loose, no grip left in them at all. The year just past had gone out of her and into the ground, and what was left was light as ash. She breathed, and the melt dropped, and the two sounds kept each other company there, hers and the years, falling into the same slow time. Outside, the moon went down behind the mountain. The glen kept its pale glow a while yet from the snow itself. At the eve the water gathered and hung and let go, A drop fell to the stone below and joined the little wet thread of melt already running there, out over the snow, a hair's breadth further than the drop before it. Then another gathered at the turf and hung and let go. The winter loosened drop by drop and gave itself back to the ground it had kept. And in the low red light of the last fire of the year, under the weight of the grey wool, the old woman lay warm and easy, while the roof came bare above her, one soft handful of snow at a time.